Welcome and congratulations on making it to the final day of the We the People National Finals. I'm Diana Owen. I'm a political science professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C.
Welcome and congratulations. I am Tom Tinder and I'm an attorney in Charleston, West Virginia.
I'm Steve Franzik, retired professor of political science from the U.S. Naval Academy. And as you introduce yourself, make sure you unmute yourself. I notice you're all muted.
So if you could introduce yourselves and then your teacher.
Hi, judges. My name is Hope Hutchinson, and my favorite non-governmental organization is the Equal Justice Initiative for their work towards prison reform.
Hello, my name is Gabe Smeeds, and my favorite non-governmental organization is Food for the Hungry for their humanitarian relief work as well as sustainable development projects.
Hello, judges. My name is Shelby Williams, and my favorite non-governmental organization is UNICEF for its work towards the welfare of children. And on behalf of Unit 6, Tahoma High School, our advisor Gretchen Wolfing, and the state of Washington, we thank you for judging us today.
Great, thank you. So your question for today is number 2. President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." Do you agree or disagree? Why? What disagreements did the founders have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? To what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence? Please begin.
We must learn to compose differences not with arms, but with intellect and decent purpose. Dwight D. Eisenhower.
President Eisenhower, in his final speech as president, warns the American citizens of the dangers of the military-industrial complex, which he refers to as the joining of an immense military establishment and the new large arms industry.
We agree with Eisenhower's stance of concern towards the military-industrial complex.
Eisenhower argues that the complex will place too high of an importance on the military and that a large standing army is not needed as it funnels resources away from necessary projects such as hospitals and schools.
The dangers of the military-industrial complex are more prevalent today than in Eisenhower's presidency. In the words of former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, does the number of warships we have really put America at risk when the U.S. battle fleet is larger than the next 13 navies combined?
Eisenhower was warning that overspending for an inactive military could lead to the citizens losing control of the military-industrial complex. In 2019, defense spending alone reached $732 billion, more than the following 10 countries combined.
With current allies and trends, the budget for weaponry cannot be justified, as overspending has high potential for misplaced power within the military-industrial complex.
Many founders opposed a large standing army, similar to the existing armed forces today, due to the fear of tyranny.
Thomas Jefferson believed that a strong national military would become overbearing, leading to corruption and tyrannical rule over dissenting citizens. He felt strongly that standing armies were inconsistent with individual freedoms and were a juxtaposition to the fundamental ideals that America was built upon.
However, Jefferson believed that an army could work successfully if citizens felt it upon themselves to act in civic duty in times of war.
In the opposite, John Adams had a differing view, favoring a strong standing army and navy, modeled after America's European counterparts. He believed that a strong standing army would not only deter possible war, but also put the country in a proactive war stance.
We recognize Jefferson's views on the worries of a large military, however, argue that his views on a civic duty-based military would not be feasible in today's society, as most citizens would not take it upon themselves to join the forces without incentive, and the government cannot force them to volunteer.
Adams' views are more applicable to today's society, as a strong military presence within the United States has been helpful for its citizens.
Following 9/11, the United States military preparedness was essential in the original response and ensuing conflict with Afghanistan and the mission for Osama bin Laden. The strong military presence that America maintained at the time has been necessary in times of attack or invasion.
On multiple occasions, overbearing U.S. intervention has been more harmful than beneficial, both to other countries and to U.S. citizens.
A prime example of international military backfiring being the conflict in Afghanistan. Over a 9-year period, an estimated 1 million citizens have been killed, as well as 18,000 Afghan troops. The United States military involvement in Afghanistan has continually disappointed and shows very little progress of its goal of defeating al-Qaeda and creating a Western-style democracy.
Instead, we argue that the U.S. military presence should aim to ensure diplomacy and democracy, only being used when the U.S. or its allies are being threatened, or when foreign nations directly ask for American intervention.
The U.S. presence in Operation Tomochichi, a $90 million disaster relief mission for Japan after the deadly earthquake and tsunami in 2011, succeeded in bringing relief during a humanitarian crisis. From this, repairs and rescues were made within Japan, and the connection between the U.S. and Japan was strengthened.
In addition, the U.S. military presence was helpful in creating the 1948 Marshall Plan. From the Marshall Plan, NATO was created to unify and strengthen Western allies and protect the freedom of its members, allowing the United States to act as a superpower simultaneously.
Although there are good intentions, the negative outcomes of U.S. intervention largely outweigh the positive and ultimately set the country back.
We can do fine actions even if we do not rule earth and sea, for even from moderate resources, we do actions that accord with virtue. Aristotle.
Thanks very much. And now we'll ask you some follow-up questions. You actually started to mention the role of the military in humanitarian missions. Can you elaborate on whether you believe that the U.S. should become involved in these humanitarian missions? Should they increase or decrease their humanitarian presence?
I would argue that when the United States looks towards humanitarian issues, we go in with the intention of trying to help those whose unalienable rights are being infringed upon, or their basic human rights that can be a blanket statement across the globe are being infringed upon. This can be seen when countries directly ask for U.S. intervention, but if the United States goes in with the intention of trying to act as a superpower and a be-all, save-all, then we can start to see other issues and conflicts ensuring.
To expand on my colleague, I believe that currently when the U.S. does intervene to aid in these humanitarian efforts, we often come in as a nation seeking something else out of it, going in for more of a political view rather than a full humanitarian effort. Whereas I argue that as a military, as our nation, we should instead turn to being the superpower that we are, use our increase resources and technology to help and aid these lower developed countries.
I would agree with my colleagues. I do believe that the U.S. should, since we do have the resources, as my colleagues have stated, we really want to help those that are being negatively affected. And if we have this military budget, we might as well use it to ensure that we are helping other countries in a positive way, but also ensuring that that help is going to be necessary.
Should the government require all citizens to register for selective service? Why or why not?
I would argue that no, the United States military should not require that there is a government mandated service within the United States. We see this in countries such as Israel, where citizens are forced to go into the military. And while it does create a sense of unity, I don't believe that it would be feasible in the United States government because we do have that freedom of choice and it would be an infringement upon basic rights.
To disagree with my colleague, I would argue that it is necessary that all Americans sign up for the selective service. As we can see, following the Pearl Harbor attack, we did have an increased support and sign up for the military. However, it was nowhere near the amount needed to effectively combat in World War II.
I would like to disagree with my colleague Hope. I believe that I would believe that the United States should not, since it is not necessary. When the draft was created, it was during a time when the United States truly needed it. However, nowadays, so many people are joining the military on their own terms and due to their own will, and it is not required by the government. We already have such a large military without it being required. So I do not believe requiring service would truly make a dent.
We have all these differing policies, America First, or now from our most recent president, or excuse me, our immediate past president, and then our current president wants to expand our involvement around the world. And then, you know, you talked about there being a strong military presence and then humanitarian. In this hyper partisan atmosphere that we have, how are these decisions going to be made and how best can they be made for the benefit of our country and its citizens?
I would argue that while we shouldn't be promoting isolationism within our country, as that has negative connotations and oftentimes creates a white supremacy sense of nationalism, we should be internally focused on pressing issues that are happening now. A prime example of this being the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw countries such as Afghanistan effectively handle the pandemic as they were able to cooperate with the Taliban. However, our own leaders in the United States were having issues and were spreading false information via social media about the pandemic. So if we can focus our attention on what's directly affecting our citizens today, then we can try and outreach ourselves into other foreign issues. But we have to start with a strong basis at home before we go in and try and intervene and help those abroad.
I would argue that the United States does need to focus on issues domestically before we go into other countries. When we are focusing on international objectives, when we are focusing on domestic objectives, international objectives will seem impossible to overcome. And another large issue within the United States is polarization. If we are not able to unite the citizens of our own country, we cannot be expected to unite the citizens of other countries and truly ensure that their rights are not being infringed upon.
Let me ask a question that is broader in terms of Unit 6, and that is the fact that there's legislation being proposed in a number of states to make voting requirements more strict. Why do you suppose we're discussing that at this point in time, and do you think it's a good idea?
I would argue that no, it is not a good idea. Voter disenfranchisement is one of the largest issues in the United States, specifically in Washington states. A large population, which would be Native Americans, are being disenfranchised because they don't have proper mailing U.S. addresses as they live on reservations. And when we see this disenfranchised group not being able to vote, then we see a large population not being represented in the United States, and that's what our country was built upon. So to directly answer your question, I would say no, that these voter stricter laws should not necessarily be enforced as it infringes upon Americans' right to vote.
To answer the first part of your question, these arguments are being brought up due to the recent the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the concerns raised by former President Donald Trump, arguing that mail-in ballots can lead to an increased level and increased number of fraudulent voters. And he argued that there should be stricter restrictions posed on these voting because of this. However, we can see, to agree with my colleague Hope, we can see that mail-in ballots have a less than 1/100% of fraudulent voters.
To add on to what my colleagues have already said, I would argue that we should not have stricter laws. The Voting Rights Act was created to ensure that many would have the right to vote. However, just recently, Georgia passed new laws to strengthen voting security. And if we're going to be strengthening this, we need to focus on the voter disenfranchisement that is already occurring, as my colleague Hope brought up. And we should not be trying to strengthen it, as that democracy is what our country really lives on. And by getting rid of that, it would not be beneficial.
Under what circumstances, if any, should the National Guard be deployed domestically?
I would argue that the National Guard should be deployed domestically when we see terrorist acts being incited, or there's a threat to United States citizens. A prime example of where I believe that the National Guard should have been deployed was in the insurrection at the Capitol. That was a direct threat to not only Washington, D.C. citizens, but congressmen and women. And if the National Guard had been deployed, we could have seen a strengthened sense of security, and it would have allowed for these threats to almost be eliminated.
To disagree with my colleague, I believe that the National Guard can also have various other uses, as we can see throughout various states, the ongoing COVID pandemic. The National Guard is being deployed to help administer vaccines throughout different states as well.
And to add on, I believe that the National Guard should be utilized to help keep citizens safe. We've seen where the National Guard has been deployed during Black Lives Matter protests to, help to keep the peace. However, 89% of these protests started out peacefully, and then once police or the National Guard arrived, that's when these protests turned violent and riots erupted. So I would argue that the National Guard should stick to their stance of really being there to help promote peace and really help the people as a whole.
I saw that you talked, or we talked in a previous question about the selective service Tell me what you think the advantages and disadvantages of having a draft are.
I would argue that an advantage for having a draft would be having that necessary amount of individuals fighting for the United States. If the United States was in a dire need where citizens needed to be on the forefront of an issue, we could selectively poll citizens and then have that united front. So in that case, we can take citizens and really utilize the amount of people we have to combat the issue at hand.
To expand on my colleague, most American citizens would not feel it upon themselves to voluntarily enlist for the military. However, we can see that there are a number that do that voluntarily, that keep our strong military presence as we have currently ongoing. However, in times of war, may I finish?
Sure.
In times of war, or times of crisis, we do need that elevated number of military personnel that the selective service is very useful for installing.
Great, thanks very much for your presentation. And now we'll give you some feedback. First of all, I thought you did a really nice job with your opening statement. I thought you began, which I think is a good thing, by defining what is meant by the military-industrial complex, particularly in light of Eisenhower's views and expression about what this meant. I thought you also did a really nice job of talking about the Jefferson and Adams and Jefferson and their conflict over whether we should have an army or whether there can be, civic duty can take over in times of war. And you gave some good explanations about what you felt about each position. I really liked the fact that when you were answering my question about humanitarian kind of assistance that could be provided by the military-industrial complex or the military. You didn't give the simple answer of saying, oh, yeah, that's great, good for us to go over and help other people out. Instead, you basically, talked about how you'd be fine, but as a superpower, we might go there with some sort of, political objectives as opposed to simply providing aid to help people. And I thought that was a really sophisticated way of answering that question. I thought that you handled the questions that had to, do with voting and not necessarily with the question itself. You jumped right in and were able to talk about that, I thought, quite well. The one thing that I thought might have come up a little bit more is to talk about the constitutional foundations of this whole issue and kind of integrate that into the even your opening statements or in the responses to the questions a little bit more. I really liked the way that sometimes you agreed with one another and built on each other's statements, but at other times you respectfully disagreed. And I thought that was really good dynamic between the team. And I really appreciated there was some attempts to relate what happened to certain things in your state to kind of integrate, kind of the experience that you have within the state. So overall, really great job.
Let me use one of your techniques and say, let me add on to what my colleague said, because I agreed, of course, with all of what she mentioned, and she took some things that I had listed here to mention. So let me go on and mention a few other things. I really enjoyed your opening 4-minute presentation, starting out with a different Eisenhower quote, and then the process of you giving just a short, interesting, informative 2 sentences or 3 sentences as you jumped from one to the other. I just from my standpoint, I appreciated that, because that let me focus on each one rather than one person giving 3 or 4 paragraphs of information and all. So I just, from a presentation standpoint, kudos to you. I thought you did a very good job in responding to the questions that we presented to you. You brought up the Marshall Plan. I believe that's the first time we've heard that, and that's a good example as it relates to the international situation. I just thought that you did a good job all the way through. and congratulations to you. You know, you started out by each of you telling us some particular non-governmental entity that you supported or were interested in or involved in and so forth. So that demonstrates your leadership capabilities and your understanding of the needs of your local community or your state. You've already demonstrated, of course, your wealth of knowledge and information. So please don't let this We the People program be the end of your commitment, your involvement, all the aspects that you have of being a good citizen. And as you go forward with further educational pursuits or what other job and career activities that you're going to have, please continue to stay involved and participate and use your knowledge and your leadership to benefit your local communities, your state, and our nation. Thank you. Congratulations and good luck to you.
My colleagues have preempted most of what I was going to say. You did a good job. The one thing I do think you did a particularly good job with was linking my question about voting rights with representation and how that might harm representation. So I thought you did a good job that way. Just think in terms of the rarefied atmosphere you're in here, in terms of being in the national finals. If you look back historically, most major change in our society has come about because a small group of well-informed people have pushed it forward. So you're going to be that small group of people in the future. You're going to be part of that small group of people in the future. So go get them. We'd like to thank you very much for participating and thank your teacher also, who did an excellent job.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.